Now, Georgia's capital, Tbilisi, has been hit by a fourth night of clashes outside Parliament. Protesters have been gathering there since Thursday, which was when the government suspended efforts to join the European Union. Polls show that a clear majority of Georgians favour EU membership, and many fear the ruling Georgian Dream Party is trying to move closer to Russia. Georgia's Prime Minister has rejected calls for new elections.
Tens of thousands of demonstrators surround the parliament in Tbilisi. Most are peaceful, but as the police close in, heavy fights break out, just as the nights before. The protests were sparked by the parliament's decision to suspend talks on joining the European Union. But Prime Minister Badridze denies he's taking Georgia off the path to EU membership.
The response is very clear. So we have not suspended anything related to the European integration. It's just a lie. And there are the opposition leaders, there are the media outlets linked with the opposition who are just lying to these people. But nobody has suspended the European integration of Georgia. We are very much committed to the European integration.
EU-friendly opposition forces accuse the Georgian Dream Party of trying to tilt the country more towards Russia. The opposition has been boycotting parliament ever since disputed elections in October and has been calling for a new vote. So has Georgia's president. President Salome Zurabishvili supports the protest and is supposed to leave office by the end of the year. But she is refusing to do so unless there are new elections, leading to a standoff between the head of state and the government. And on the streets, it's clear that more than a month after the disputed elections, which returned the Georgian Dream Party to power, the country is at another major crossroads.
DW correspondent Maria Katamadze is covering the protests in Tbilisi for us. And Maria, these protests, they've been taking place for months now. They've clearly entered a new stage. Are demonstrators any closer to achieving what they want?
Well, it doesn't seem like they are close to achieving their goals, given that the police violence is intensifying as the protests grow, and they're set to grow. But there are no signs from the government that they are ready to reconsider their decisions, or they are ready to leave, resign. So it's definitely very challenging times today in Georgia, and many people on the streets are very disturbed by this situation. It's definitely, there are fears that the situation can escalate to the point where Georgia may potentially, see the Belarusian scenario unfolding in their country. There are fears like that. We've been hearing that from the streets, given that the police is not stopping and is intensifying, as I said, their crackdown. But there is some people that are fearing that it can provoke Russia again to invade Georgia. We've met, a couple of people, for instance, one man who told me, what if we, if we end up like Ukraine? But I think that the majority of Georgians really view this as a fight for the independence, as they say. Their resistance to the Russian influence, which is now represented, as they believe, by their government. I would now suggest maybe to take a look at the reactions that we gathered today in Tbilisi.
The protest will continue until the very end, until our youth in Georgia win.
We have to stand together with our young people. How can they beat them up so much?
I view the government's decision very negatively. This is a dramatic change of our foreign policy towards the West that we have been pursuing for years.
All right, some of the voices of people on the streets of Tbilisi there. Maria, Georgia's pro-Russian Prime Minister is saying that the country is still on its path to EU membership, despite cancelling accession talks with the bloc last week. Can you tell us more about what his thinking is?
Well, there is definitely a contradiction there, and I think it's aimed at to seemingly ease the tensions and to calm, public outcry that we've been witnessing for, days in Tbilisi now. So I think it's also aimed at sort of domestic audience as well as, European officials that, it's just a misunderstanding. We are still on European track. But nobody, at least people on the streets don't seem to believe that, because the actions and the facts are showing, otherwise. So it's also it will be sort of crucial to see what are the next statements from the government. But they don't, as I said, they don't sort of show any sign of reversing its decision. Many people consider their government illegitimate, at least the protesters, and they're demanding the resignation. But the government insists that it's legitimate. So you have sort of two layers to the story. First, that people are not happy with the contested elections, and the second, that the government is turning away from Europe.
All right. Just briefly, Maria, EU and US officials have criticised the Georgian government's handling of these protests. Has the ruling party responded to this criticism?
Now, the ruling party is in turn accusing some European officials of, inciting the protests. But what we in reality see from the European Union is words of concerns, and, and people are also telling me sometimes that, we should see more sort of decisive actions from the European Union. But still, the government is managing to sort of accuse the West of trying to incite a revolution in the country, which, from the ground, it seems like a very sort of grassroots, very natural sort of, national movement against what people here call the Russian government. And I think that the stakes are very high today for the government because they, don't seem to be, proving that they are pro-EU to their public, and their public is overwhelmingly pro-European. So there is definitely a big gap between government and its people, and it's unclear how it's going to, end up this sort of situation. And the government is determined to sort of crack down people more, and people are still determined to take to the streets.
All right.
It's quite a developing picture.
Maria, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much. That's DW's Maria Katamadze.
Giorgi Badridze is a senior fellow at the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. He's also a former diplomat who's held various positions in Georgia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was once the country's ambassador to the UK. Welcome to DW. Let's start with the issue that seems to be at the...
Good to be back.
Thank you. Let's start with the issue that seems to be at the heart of these disturbances. That's accession to the EU. When the Prime Minister says he is not suspending anything to do with EU integration, should we believe him?
Well, it's about which of his words we should believe, because his words contradict from day to day. We should believe his actions. And sadly, Georgia's real integration with the European Union has been basically stopped long ago. It was just a final confession that this regime has stopped pretending that they are taking Georgia into the European Union and NATO.
Though, to be fair, the EU did freeze Georgia's application just a month after granting it candidate status.
Yes, and for a good reason, because this regime has been building a Russian-style power vertical instead of implementing the reforms that are necessary to comply with the European criteria. So, in words, for more than a decade, like I said, Ivanishvili government has been signing the association agreement, the deep and free, comprehensive free trade deal with the European Union. In reality, they've been building a Russian-style regime, getting very close with Russia, including economically. Just to give you an example, after signing the DCFTA, instead of reorienting Georgia's foreign trade towards the European Union, Russia became the #1 trade partner.
So help us understand what's going on inside the country. If, as you believe, Georgian dream is heading towards Russia, why don't they say so? Why say we love Europe while your actions betray otherwise?
The reason is very simple, because absolute majority of Georgians want to live in the European democracy. More than 80% of Georgians consistently tell to the pollsters that they want membership in the European Union, and more than 70% say that they want to be part of NATO. And the Ivanishvili government came to power. They won power based on this promise that they would continue the pro-Western path. But instead, they turned out to be a Russian Trojan horse. That's very short, in a nutshell, what the situation is. Georgians want to live in the European democracy, and the oligarch, whose wealth is comparable to a quarter or even more of the Georgian GDP, wants to build an oligarch's dream. It's not a Georgian dream like they call their party, it's the oligarch's dream.
And so now we have a standoff between a president who is due to step down, who says she will not, and she is standing up to the prime minister who has been re-elected. How do you think that standoff will end?
First, not only this president doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the newly formed government, but not a single democratic partner of Georgia has recognized that these elections were free and fair, and therefore the government that was formed at the back of it is a legitimate one. The opposition believes, and all reputable observers believe, that the combined opposition has won, and that the votes were stolen, the election was rigged, various manipulations were used, pressure was applied to the voters, vote buying, but also ballot stuffing, which is registered, which is recorded on videos, and various other technologies borrowed from Russia were used. I mean, at this election in November, Ivanishvili regime used all the methods by which Putin has been establishing the power vertical, first by stealing the votes, and then basically by consolidating what he himself calls the power vertical. This election was basically an attempt to solidify, to consolidate the regime, which is much more resembles the Russian system and not that of the European Union.
OK, so where we are then is Georgia has apparently a stolen election, violent clashes on the streets, and EU talks are now frozen. Where does it go from there?
Well, the ideal scenario would be if the regime backs down and basically agrees with the demands of the president, of the opposition, and many of our partners, and holds a new fair and free election, which would be monitored and maybe even administered by our international partners.
But
the new election would be the only way out of this crisis.
Except that the government says no to a new election. So that would be your ideal. Which way do you think it will go?
Well, at the moment, every day, thousands and tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands Georgians are taking to the streets, and they are demonstrating their will. This is almost unprecedented, that not just in Tbilisi, but in all Georgian towns and cities, you have huge number of people coming out and making their voices heard. The government so far is responding with violence, and unfortunately, like I said, it would be ideal if the government simply listened to the Georgian people, listened to the international partners of Georgia. Well, the alternative is not very nice.
But haven't we seen this movie before? As you were speaking, we were looking at that film of fireworks and people in the streets, which reminded me of the scenes that we saw in Ukraine in 2014. And we can see where that ended. Is Georgia heading in the same direction?
Well, I hope you're not proposing for us to simply comply with the Russian regime. Georgians are freedom-loving people. We fought for our independence in the late 80s and early 90s. We fought against much more formidable enemy, Russia, when it invaded Georgia. We would not surrender that easily. And yes, if it takes a real fight, we'll probably have to fight. I'm not sure we can count on anyone else to do our business. If Georgia wants to remain an independent democratic country, then people must make their voices heard.
It's a sobering analysis, and we thank you for it. Giorgi Badridze from the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we can talk now to Robert Hamilton. He's the head of the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Robert, it's good to see you. So there is no sign that the protests are letting up, but is there a clear path for them to succeed with their pressure campaign?
Well, it's a good question, Aaron. And as you noted in the intro, this is the fifth night of protests. And the protests followed the government's announcement that it was suspending EU accession talks and refusing aid from the European Union, which is something that really angered and energized the Georgian people in ways that previous government decisions or moves, the October parliamentary elections and the foreign agent law that the government pushed through this spring, did not. People were angry at that, and tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people came to the streets, but nothing of this magnitude. So in terms of a path forward, I think the opposition and the majority of the Georgian people, I think, who polls indicate consistently that 70 to 80% of Georgian people are for membership in the EU. What their goal is a rerunning of the October parliamentary elections under international supervision, and then a restart of Georgia's EU accession process. I think this is as close as we've ever seen this Georgian government to caving into pressure from civil society.
But at the same time, it does seem that the government is attempting to delegitimize the protest. The Georgian prime minister recently said that the opposition was trying to stage a pro-EU uprising with funds from abroad. Is there any actual direct evidence of foreign interference in these protests?
No, not at all. There's no foreign interference in these protests. Georgia's Western partners have been very clear that they believe that the suspension of the EU accession process is a mistake. Although it's a Georgian sovereign decision, the problem is the government is at odds with its own people now. And so, again, large majorities of the Georgian people believe that their future lies in the European Union. And so delegitimizing that sentiment and trying to delegitimize the protest puts the government at odds with a large majority of its own people.
But at the same time, the Georgian Dream Party is at least publicly claiming that they're still interested in joining the EU. Do you think that's just rhetoric, or do you actually believe them?
All the government's actions indicate that it is not interested in joining the EU. It's interested in the economic benefits that would come with EU membership, but it's not interested in signing up to the rules of EU membership in terms of democratic elections, in terms of allowing a free and robust civil society, independent media. All these things are things on which the Georgian government has been cracking down for the last several years. So it's at odds with the EU in terms of its democratic credentials, its laws, its attitude toward its own civil society. So I think if you gave this Georgian government a choice of remaining in power or joining the EU, it would choose to remain in power.
And of course, many of the demonstrators are worrying that the Georgian government is attempting to bring the country more in line with the political influence of Moscow. And we even heard Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president, warning that Georgia was moving down a similar path to Ukraine. Do you see a threat in that rhetoric?
there are always veiled threats in the Kremlin's rhetoric, of course. And so the question is, how does Russia respond to this? In the Kremlin, there's always there's a proclivity or a tendency to see these civil uprisings that overthrow corrupt authoritarian regimes as somehow inspired or directed by the Western intelligence services. This goes back to the original 2003 Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange and Maidan revolutions in Ukraine, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, all of which were civil society movements. So they were popular movements that overthrew corrupt authoritarian regimes. In the Kremlin, they are seen as inspired or directed by Western intelligence services, despite the fact that there's no evidence for that.
And of course, in that threat by, or rather the statement by Medvedev, there was kind of a veiled threat of violence. Do you think if this could continue to go down the path it is at the moment, could we see some type of intervention, a direct intervention on the part of Russia?
Well, and again, that's the most critical question in this, I think. Russia obviously has its hands busy in Ukraine. It also has its hands busy now in Syria. I know you're going to talk about that on the show, but the Assad regime, the Iranians, and Hezbollah, which are Russia's partners in Syria, have been dealt a pretty serious blow by the opposition over the past several days. But Russia does have several thousand troops stationed in Georgian territory illegally in South Ossetia and Abkhazia to breakaway regions that Russia seized in 2008 after it invaded Georgia. So it does have the capacity, I think, to mount some sort of operation. We obviously hope it doesn't come to that. The question is what the Georgian government would do. Is it in dire enough straits that it would request assistance from Moscow, or would it resist, either sort of diplomatically by back channel telling the Russians, please don't intervene, let us handle this, or would it resist publicly? I don't have an answer to that question. I think we're in some really uncertain times right now.
Yes, that we certainly are. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. That was Robert Hamilton with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you very much for your analysis.
Thank you.